The first stories in this collection were submitted by subscribers. Story 1 by Christian Roman. Now I know how crazy this is going to sound, but I need you to bear with me. This happened to me a little over a year ago, so some details may be a little off, but it shook me enough I will never forget the experience. I'm not going to give my name or my hometown where this happened, but I will tell you this happened in Wyoming. This was back when I lived on a ranch surrounded with tons of forest that belonged to my uncle. I'll just call him Jay. He had let me stay there, and in return I had to do some manual labour, such as maintain the livestock. My Uncle Jay kept pigs, cows and chickens. I even helped give birth to a few piglets in my time there, which was quite the experience, let me tell you. I had gone out for dinner one night with a couple of my friends. I hadn't gotten to finish all my work for the day, so when I got back Uncle Jay made me finish it, or he'd make me sleep out there till I did. So, as soon as I got back, I immediately got to work, despite being tired from how much I'd eaten. When I was cleaning up some of the feces in the pigsty, which was one of my last tasks for the night, I'd heard what sounded like a branch snap in the surrounding woods. I assumed it was just some coyotes or worst case scenario, a bear. So when I finished, I made sure to lock up the barn extra tight and double-checked all the locks. Everything but the chickens were kept in the barn. They had a chicken coop and a pen closer to the house, while the barn was maybe 60 feet from the house. After I locked up, I went in the house and saw my uncle passed out drunk on the couch with the television still playing. I thought that maybe I could have just ignored doing the work. It's not like he would have been awake to yell at me. So I left him on the couch, not wanting to wake him up, knowing if I did, he'd be in a pissy mood. But before I left, I noticed on the television my Uncle Jay had on, the news was playing a rerun of the day. And I remember seeing talk about a man who went missing while in the forest, one not too far from the ranch. And I distinctively recall the man in the photo having some of the brightest blue eyes I had ever seen, like they were diamonds. So I turned the TV off and went up to my bedroom that had previously belonged to my cousin until he went off to college 4 or 5 years ago, and I had gone and laid in bed. I don't think I had ever fallen asleep so quickly in my life, but no amount of sleep could prepare me for the morning to come. I awoke to my door being slammed open by my uncle and him yelling and cursing at me for leaving the barn door open, but that made no sense to me. I had made sure to lock it up tighter than usual. I explained this to my uncle, and not believing me, he made me follow him out to the barn in my underwear and a pair of boots. When we got there, I saw the barn doors had been busted wide open, and all the animals lay dead with their stall doors open. Every single one of their corpses had had their heads bitten off, and most of their stomachs chewed out, with big claw marks on the majority of them. When I say big, I mean huge. On the pigs, you could only see 1 or 2 of the nail claw marks, but on the cows, you could see all 4 claw marks. With the 4 claw marks, me and my uncle automatically assumed they belonged to a grizzly bear or a black bear, which are native to the forests, until we saw how deep the cut went. The cuts went as deep as what looked like half a foot deep, which is 2 inches longer than the average bear claw of 4 inches. And I don't know how any bear could be hungry enough to eat 5 cows and 7 pigs. The other thing was the locks. We would usually put 3 padlocks and sometimes a plank of wood to lock it up, but all 3 locks were completely destroyed. The metal hook was completely severed from the body of the lock, and the plank of wood had been smashed into 3 different parts. There was also a lot of damage at the edges of the doors where they made contact from whatever broke in. Me and my uncle were speechless. My uncle said he thought it was a grizzly, but I could tell by his tone of voice he was trying to play it off so as not to scare me more than I already was. After this, my uncle told me to always keep a shotgun on my shoulder while working. He kept a few 12 gauges in his bedroom, so he gave me one and an extra ammo pouch that I kept on my belt, and he did the same. I had cleaned up the animal carcasses, but we were able to harvest a bit of meat, just enough for about 3 meals for each of us. The rest was contaminated and diseased. My uncle decided it was best to bring the chickens inside, and he put them in the basement. We didn't speak much about what had transpired, but we were both thinking of it. I asked him, while we were eating supper, what he thought it was. He said it would have been some sort of giant grizzly bear, but I don't think that would account for the appetite it had. Later that night, me and my uncle stayed up late. Neither of us said it, but I think we both wanted to see if we could catch a glimpse at whatever it was that broke into the barn. We turned on the TV to pass the time, and the local news was reporting on the same man as yesterday, except there had been a development in the case. The police had found multiple dead human bodies in his home that he had been eating. They think he didn't just go missing. They said they thought he was trying to get off the grid. This startled me. Not only is there some monster running around, but there was a cannibal too. A part of me hoped he would get eaten by the monster, but I also thought he should just rot in jail. After staying awake till about 2 looking out of the windows with my uncle, I went to bed while he stayed awake. When I went downstairs in the morning, my uncle had fallen asleep on the couch with his shotgun in his hand. The first thing I did was check on the chickens and feed them. All were accounted for but one. I assumed we had accidentally left him in the chicken coop the day before, so I went to it to confirm my suspicion. When I arrived, I saw, to my horror, that the chicken coop had been busted into and destroyed. It looked like the creature that did this tore the wall apart and then destroyed the rest of it. I saw the leg of a chicken and what was left of the body being eaten by a raccoon. It seemed the monster from the night before had struck again. There were the same claw marks lining the wood. I, of course, immediately woke up my uncle to show him the carnage. We searched the area for any clues as to what that creature could be, and I came across the creature's footprint. It looked almost like a human, but more slender than any foot I've ever seen. At least 16 inches long, and it had huge claws. This footprint immediately discredited the idea of it being a bear. This kept getting weirder and weirder. At this point, I insisted to my uncle that we call in some hunters to find whatever this creature is and kill it. But he refused to let anyone hunt on his land after one of the hunters accidentally shot his second wife, my aunt, and killed her while he was walking deep in the woods. His bullet had gone right through a deer and into her body. But ever since then, my uncle refused to let any non-family on the land. Later that night, my uncle said he was going to try and hunt the creature, but I was able to convince him to wait till morning, and I'm so glad I did. I had awoke in the middle of the night to a tap on the window. I thought nothing of it at first, because sometimes on windy nights, acorns on the tree next to the house blow off and hit my window, so I just kept my eyes closed and attempted to fall back asleep. But the acorns started to get a lot louder than usual, and I still didn't hear any wind. But then suddenly, it stopped, and did not slow stop, but an immediate stop to nothing. Despite how creeped out I was, I mustered up the courage to go and look out the window to see what it was. I have never been so terrified in my life at that moment. I wish I'd never opened my eyes that night. When I looked out the window, I saw what looked like a person, but its face was ghastly in every form of the word. His lips and all the skin covering his teeth and gums were gone. It looked as if it had chewed it off itself. The skin on its body was pale and decaying, and it had faded white hair on its head. Its long, thin body was hunched over, but it could still see through my window. It had slender limbs and long claws that seemed to match the marks in the barn and on the chicken coop. It had piercing blue eyes that scanned across my dark room. It just hadn't seen me yet. I knew I should just close my eyes and hide, but the creature mesmerized me in fear, and I felt as if my whole body had 100-pound weight on it. As I stared at the creature for about a minute, I noticed the creature didn't blink. It didn't even have eyelids. And then, a terrifying realization hit me. The eyes of that creature looked exactly like the eyes of the man on the news. Piercing diamond blue eyes that almost looked like they gave off light themselves. Then, I swear the creature looked directly at me. I froze up more than before. I even stopped breathing. After staring at me for almost a minute, the creature slouched back down and walked back into the woods. I was able to get a better look at its body. All of its limbs were slender and thin. Its arms a lot thinner than its legs, and its hands and feet were in a similar fashion. When it walked, it was on its feet upright, but it slouched over enough it almost looked like it was on 4 legs. I couldn't fall back asleep for obvious reasons, but as soon as I knew the creature was for sure gone, I crept into my uncle's room and woke him up. I told him I saw the creature that killed the livestock and described it to him. The only detail I left out was the connection to the guy on the news. I expected him to call me crazy, but, to my surprise, he believed me. The next day, after getting no sleep from either of us, we each carried a 12-gauge and a flashlight into the woods during the afternoon when the creature would likely be coming out. My uncle taught me how to use the shotgun, but I had never gone hunting with one before. We stayed close and walked through the woods. I hated the idea of coming out here and hunting it ourselves, but I know he wouldn't be convinced of letting hunters on the property. I didn't want to go out there, but I also didn't want my uncle to go alone. As me and my uncle made our way through the woods and it started getting darker, the paranoia started setting in heavily. Any tiny sound we heard, even our own footsteps, scared the both of us. I was visibly shaking, and my legs almost just wanted to collapse from buckling. After getting maybe 20 minutes deep, and as the sun started dimming, we heard a loud branch crack from behind us. It scared the living hell out of both of us, and I almost fired my gun off of impulse in the direction of the branch. We started walking toward the direction of the branch. Then, we heard the strangest thing. We heard a child crying. It sounded like a 5 to 6-year-old, but I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl. We both looked at each other in disbelief and started to move quicker towards the crying, and once we got within maybe 50 feet of the crying, it stopped. There was rustling of leaves around us, and me and my uncle stood back to back and looked in all directions to maybe see what was around us. But then, something happened that I will never forget. I heard my aunt, the one who had died, call out to me and my uncle to go to her. She yelled for help. It was dark, but I could see my uncle was crying, which is something I've never seen him do in my entire life. He started lowering his weapon and walked toward her voice, with me following close behind, my gun still raised. Then, we heard her voice again behind us. When we turned around, we saw the creature crouched on the ground, and it slowly stood up as me and my uncle were frozen in pure terror. As it stood, you could hear the crackling of bones, and we were able to smell its breath, even from 10 to 20 feet away, and it was absolutely putrid. When it finished standing, it was about twice the height of my uncle, who was 5'10". It took a few seconds after it finished standing, but we started firing on it with our guns and it let out the most ear-piercing sound. It was a loud screech that sounded almost like a hawk, if it were an elephant with tuberculosis making it screech. The lungs of the creature sounded congested, which added the fear it induced in us. We each only got a shot or two on the creature before we had to reload. While we were reloading, the creature slouched back down before it ran. It looked back at me with its piercing blue eyes one last time, and quickly sprinted back into the woods, injured. Me and my uncle hurried back to his house and locked up every door and window and hid in the basement with the chickens the entire night. That was the last we saw of that creature. I'm not sure if we killed it or it stopped bothering us, but it never came back. After a couple of months, my uncle got some new cows and pigs to replace the old ones, and added multiple stronger locks to the barn door, and he fixed the chicken coop. I moved out not long after he got the new livestock, and was able to buy my own place. I did some research, and I'm pretty sure what was tormenting us was a Wendigo, and I'm convinced that it was that cannibal on the news that turned into the Wendigo. But whatever that thing was, I pray I never have to see it again. The next stories in this video are from Reddit. Before I continue to the next story, I just want to say a big thank you for choosing to watch this video. I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you are, please go ahead and hit the like button to this video, and if you don't already, subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Thanks again. Story 2 by Plague 692. I live in the small town of Willow Creek. The town has a population of around 5,000. The town is made up of a bunch of disjointed chunks of land that meet up in the middle in a sort of town square. We are mostly farmland, but we also have large amounts of open forest. One of the forests is nicknamed Black Willow. It's super big, and it wraps around my house. The land is owned by an old Native American man named Owen from the close-by native reserve. We call it Black Willow because not only is it massive, spanning 15 acres, but due to its thickness and deposits of natural magnets near the surface, it means phones and compasses don't work there. Old man Owen won't let anyone map the place, which isn't even close to helping the situation. The only reason he let us put our house here is because my dad and one of Owen's sons are very good friends. There's no internet out there, so the only way to get online time is to either go to my friend Derek's house, 15-minute drive, or the internet cafe in town, 25-minute drive. The first time we noticed weird stuff happening was a couple of weeks after my family and I moved into the house. One night, we heard one long scratching noise from one side of the house. In the morning, we went outside to check it out, and there was a long, deep scratch from one side of the house to the other, easily over 7 feet in the air. My dad went over to Owen's cabin to ask if there is a bear that lives in the forest. My dad said the only thing he said back was, "There used to be a bear." For some extra background, Owen was an avid hunter, so my dad thought he killed it, so he came back and said the problem was resolved. The biggest issue was that no matter what kind of animal we got, other than dogs and cats we kept inside, they would always end up dead by some sort of predator. No matter the locks or reinforcement we put on, they would always die within about a week or so. We also set up bear traps outside. The first night we set up the traps, we got a hit. We went out and checked the trap. We found a broken trap and some blood. The blood was very light in colour, as if the creature was anemic, and even though it was spilled minutes before, the blood was cold to the touch. The screech we heard before we left was something unnatural. I've been hunting and studying animals for a large chunk of my life, and I've never heard that sound anywhere else but there, in those woods. The worst of it was during our first winter living in South Dakota, the snow got thick, and the only things that could move through it were rabbits and wolves. But there were other things not seen. There were several people who went missing in the centermost part of town. Their bodies were found in Black Willow by both my house and Owen's cabin. As they should have, the police questioned all of us, but nothing came up. Then one day a black van showed up in our driveway. They questioned us like the police, but what they asked was very strange. Some of the things they asked were, "Have you been hunting recently?" or "Have you been to the Black Creek?" They seemed to be strange questions to ask while doing an investigation into murders, but I wouldn't question professionals at work. Then the last blizzard of winter hit. Around the town, they always call the last storm of winter the Dragon's Arse. I didn't really get it, but again, I didn't question them. When the Dragon's Arse came around, most people were trapped in their homes. The blizzard sealed off doors and windows, and most people couldn't leave. My family could, because the forest soaked up most of the snow, so it felt like a normal snowfall to us. But I swear I could hear banging noises on the roof some nights. And by the way my parents and brother looked after every time, I knew they heard it too. When winter turned to spring, and the reason why I'm writing this happened, during the night I heard the sound of muted work and chanting. I went outside to check on it, which brought me to the end of my driveway. What I found was an easily 10-foot tall fence with strange markings going around the full thing on the inside and the outside of the barrier. The smell of recently burnt sage filled the air, and I decided to go back to bed and check it out fully in the morning. When I went back around 8 a.m., I found that the fence went around the whole forest, as well as the symbols that followed it. I made my way to Owen's cabin to ask about it, and what I found was gruesome. When I entered the cabin, the stench hit me and made me gag and dry heave. I went over to Owen's hangout room and found him dead. His torso open like a Ziploc bag, and his organs absent from the gaping hole. There were bite marks all over him that looked like human teeth, but they were way too large. I ran back home and told my dad about the fence and about Owen. He freaked out and grabbed his gun from the safe and ran outside to the cabin. When he came back, his cheeks and chin were moist like he had just thrown up. He then grabbed chairs from the kitchen and blocked off the doors, and took planks from the garage and sealed the windows. The next week or so, the nights and days were plagued by gunshots and screams. It sounded like a large group of heavily armed men would march through our plot, and from the distant screams of pain, they didn't make it back. One night, I heard a muted tapping from my window. Through the tiny gaps in the wood, I saw a dead man's body being lightly hit against my window. The long and grey hand was wrapped around his helmet. The thing was trying to coax us out. During one of the many raids of the Willow, I snuck out. When I was halfway out, I was in a creek area with a small stream passing through the middle, with a large cave to the side, full of bodies, and a bloody cave painting. A soldier pointed a weapon at me and told me to get back to my house. I darted to the fence, and he aimed his gun at me. He was only able to fire a single shot that grazed my shoulder before the creature grabbed him from behind. I climbed and jumped the fence before I looked back to see the monster. It was a freakishly tall being, at least 8 feet tall with pale grey skin and 0 gender-defining features. The creature killed the man and looked at me. It walked toward the fence slowly in a calm way to move its finger to where the symbols start. Its finger seemed to stop as a tapping sound came from an invisible wall the beast couldn't cross. I booked it to the nearest internet cafe where I write this now. I warn you, please, never go into the Black Willow, lest you wish to know the wrath of the Willow Creek Wendigo. Story 3 by Reddit user Chillin and Godzillin. So this is my first post on Reddit. I just wanted to share this story and see if something like this has ever happened to anyone else. Just to start off, some backstory. My group of friends had started making a nasty habit of joking about the Wendigo. My friend Stacy and me didn't for a while, due to the fact that we believe in the supernatural. But after a few months, it grew on us, and on knowing that the Wendigo can actually be triggered by such things, we joined in. Biggest mistake ever. I had just moved into the country, and we enjoyed making trips into town to have a few drinks, which is about a 30-minute walk from my place to town. At night, the first 10 minutes after leaving the bridge that leads out of town is pitch black darkness with no streetlights. After that, streetlights are very sparsely placed, which can cause for a very creepy walk back, without anything happening. So, with that all in place, let's continue. Stacy and I begin our night, walking into town. We get some beers and have some fun. Shortly into the night, something slightly strange happens. We receive a phone call from her little sister at home crying and scared because she saw someone sitting on my friend Stacy's bed. She calms her sister down and asks her cousin to check her room for her sister at home. Everything is fine. No one's in the room. Also, ghosts and weird things happening at her house were very common, so a sighting like this was strangely regular. We continue our night. Into the night, we meet a guy who seems pretty cool. He's riding a bike and tells us he's pretty drunk or something. We decide to hang with him for a bit, wanting to meet people in town. A ways into our hangout, we are sitting on a park bench, and the guy is laying on the ground in front of us. Suddenly, my friend stands up and says it's time for us to go. I shrug and agree, and we get going. After getting away from him, she tells me how the guy bit her ankle. The day after, she had teeth bruises on her ankle. Kinda flustered the guy would do that, we continue our walk out of town. Finally, we pass the bridge, which is our last source of light for the next 10 minutes. We turn on our phone flashlights, and we turn on some music trying to ease the spooky feeling of being in pitch darkness in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, we hear a voice beside us. We both jump. It's the same guy on his bike. He asks us if he can follow us until we reach the fork in the road. We need to go left, and he needs to go right. Still slightly creeped out, but almost at the streetlights and the fork in the road, we agree. Regardless, he had to go that way, and so did we. After a bit of walking, we finally reach the fork in the road and the first streetlight. We sigh with relief, hoping he would leave. But he turns down our way instead of going the way he needs to go. Now at this point, we are thoroughly creeped out. We try to ignore it and keep walking, holding our breaths, wanting to reach the next streetlight, which is some ways away. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reach the next streetlight, which is also, for some reason, a small graveyard. I hate my area. Once we reach the streetlight, the guy stops dead in his tracks and doesn't move any further past it. As we turn around, the guy looks like he has suddenly passed out on his bike. His head is down, and his shoulders slumped. I was about to say something to him, but my friend stopped me and said we really needed to leave him. I agreed, not wanting to be around him much longer either. After a few seconds, I take a peek over my shoulder. He's gone. Vanished. The worst part is, even if he had turned around and started pedaling as fast as he could, we still would have been able to see him some ways down the road. I panicked, but I was also slightly relieved he wasn't there anymore. We continue walking, trying to pretend we aren't creeped out. Walking quickly from streetlight to streetlight, we finally reach my driveway. My driveway is a long road of darkness. We hadn't put any lights in it yet to try and brighten it. We begin to walk slowly, holding our breath, some weird feeling of dread coming over me the closer and closer we got to my house and the further into the driveway we entered. I don't know what came over us, but the sudden feeling of, you need to run, and you need to run fast, came over us at the same time. We took off, bolting at the exact same time without having to say a word to each other. We got to my front door and I unlocked it quicker than I ever have before. We get inside. Just as I'm about to close the door, this hellish scream or growl, whatever the sound is, came out of nowhere. I could hear it getting close to the door and steps. I slammed the door closed and locked it, and dropping to the ground from fear. We both sat there holding our breaths, scared to even breathe. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and me and Stacy had forgotten about what happened. Suddenly, it came up in convo, and we tried to find the sound that we heard. Nothing worked. We looked up every possible animal, even animals that weren't likely. We spent an hour on this until we decided to look up the sound of a Wendigo. It was the only sound that fit perfectly. We don't joke or talk about it now. I won't. I hate to. Even writing this post made me feel scared to bring it up. I'm just really curious to hear if anyone had something like that happen to them. Thanks for listening and letting me share. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. Again, if you enjoyed it, please go ahead and hit the like button. And if you don't already, subscribe to my channel. Let me know what you thought of these stories in the comment section below, and let me know if there's any other themed videos you would like to hear. If you have a story you would like me to narrate on this channel, you can email me at mrsinisterstories@gmail.com. If you want to support me even further, there are a number of ways you can do it. Check out my Teespring store and consider purchasing a Mr. Sinister hoodie or t-shirt. I'll leave a link to my PayPal in the video description as well, should you feel inclined to donate to my channel. But the best way you can really help me to grow is to share this content. If you have any friends that are into scary stories or a part of any communities, please share my videos. That really helps me out. Thanks again for watching.